Hello Grand Archive players, let's answer a rules question. How can you tell when extra conditions for a trigger are considered locked in by the game? You'll be familiar with triggered abilities. They use the stack and can be identified by one of the words when, whenever, or at, or use a bolded key phrase such as on enter, on death, etc. All triggers have a trigger condition that tells you when they will try to trigger. However, some triggers have additional conditions that need to be met for them to properly resolve. You might ask questions like, when does the game check for these conditions? When do I get opportunity to influence the result? Or, do I even get opportunity at all? Depending on how the trigger is templated, the answers to these questions can be different, which in turn affects how you can play with and around these effects. For the purpose of looking into how wording affects the function of these triggers, let's enlist the help of the humble Skilled Plainsman. Skilled Plainsman has an on-enter trigger, where the trigger condition is him entering the field, with the additional condition that his controller also controls a horse ally. A few things before we proceed. When a card refers to its own name, it refers to itself, and not any other instances of this card, even if they have the same name. So Skilled Plainsman doesn't put buff counters on any other Skilled Plainsman you might have, only itself, the one that just triggered by entering the field. Also, this word equestrian in italics is called a label keyword. Unlike non-italicized card text, this word doesn't really have a functional rules meaning. Rather, it serves to tie together cards thematically and give you a clue as to what the effect is. In this case, equestrian tells you that this card and other cards with equestrian have something to do with controlling horse allies. Returning to our main topic, in order to illustrate the types of templating that triggers with extra conditions can have, I'm going to take Skilled Plainsman and make 4 clones of him, each with different wordings. I'll call these Pattern 1, Pattern 2, Pattern 3, and Pattern 4, where Pattern 4 is the original templating. Let's see how these differences in templating lead to differences in function. In Pattern 1, his ability reads, when Skilled Plainsman enters the field while you control a horse ally, put a buff counter on Skilled Plainsman. Let's look at the section before the comma, which I'll color red. I want you to think of this red part as the trigger condition. This determines under what conditions this trigger will be put onto the stack. I'll color the second part of this trigger blue. Think of this as the resolution condition. This specifies what happens when the trigger attempts to resolve from the stack. With this templating, the trigger condition in red requires that you meet the additional condition, that is, controlling a horse ally, at the time when Skilled Plainsman enters the field and attempts to trigger. This condition needs to be met when the game checks if a trigger would happen. In fact, if you don't meet this additional condition, the Plainsman won't trigger at all, so no trigger will be generated, and no resulting opportunity will be given to either player. On the other hand, this blue resolution cost doesn't have any conditions attached to it. That means that as long as this ability has triggered, there are no requirements for its resolution. This trigger will resolve regardless of the game state, even if the horse is removed in response to this trigger. Note that the trigger successfully resolving doesn't also guarantee it does anything meaningful. For example, it won't put a buff counter on Skilled Plainsman if it's no longer on the field to receive it. This type of templating is relatively uncommon, but examples of cards with this templating are Alice, Phantom Monarch, Relic of Dancing Embers, Taiji of Crystal Stratagems, Insignia of the Korhazi, Jin, Fate Defiant, and the Intercept keyword. For cards with triggers matching Pattern 1, they will check the additional condition when they trigger and go onto the stack, but not when they resolve off the stack. They will attempt to resolve even if the additional requirement stops being met after it has triggered. They will not trigger at all if the condition is not met. Now let's look at Pattern 2. When Skilled Plainsman enters the field, put a buff counter on Skilled Plainsman if you control a horse ally. Like before, I'll highlight the part before the comma in red. This represents the trigger condition. Note that this time there is no additional requirement attached to this trigger condition. This means that the ability will trigger and go onto the stack regardless of if you control a horse or not, and try to resolve regardless of the game state, unless the trigger is negated. You'll see that this time, the additional requirement has been moved to the blue resolution clause. This type of trigger formatting will check for the additional condition upon resolution. Since the trigger provides opportunity to both players, this represents a chance for you to meet this trigger condition if you didn't before, or for your opponent to interact to deny this trigger from successfully resolving. Note that, like any trigger, modes and targets are chosen as triggers and goes onto the stack, even if the trigger wouldn't properly resolve due to an additional condition being unmet. Moving on to our third pattern, when Skilled Plainsman enters the field, if you control a horse ally, put a buff counter on Skilled Plainsman. You'll notice that there are 2 commas in this triggered ability. I'll color this phrase in red. When Skilled Plainsman enters the field, if you control horse ally. This is the triggering condition. I'll color this phrase in blue. If you control a horse ally, put a buff counter on Skilled Plainsman. This phrase in between the commas is called an intervening if clause, and I'll color it purple to indicate that this is part of the additional condition on both the trigger condition and the resolution condition. In short, this condition of meeting a horse ally needs to be met at both of these times, when the trigger attempts to go onto the stack, and when the trigger attempts to leave the stack and resolve. If this seems a little familiar, this is reminiscent of the requirements for targeting, which also checks when something goes onto the stack, as well as when it resolves. Compared to patterns 1 and 2, pattern 3 is kind of the worst of both worlds in terms of restrictiveness. Like in pattern 1, this trigger condition will not trigger at all if it is not met when Plainsman enters the field. And like in pattern 2, it will not resolve with its effect if the additional condition is not met when it attempts to resolve. Note that in the case of triggered abilities, this condition doesn't have to be continuously met in between those 2 points in time, just at those 2 points. So, if your only horse ally was removed from the field after the trigger went onto the stack, you could still get it to resolve as long as you control the horse when the trigger tries to resolve, even if it's not the same horse. Examples of cards with this templating are Incandescent Reliquary, Alchemical Scripture, Forge Light Scepter, Windwalker Boots, Firebloom Flourish, Relic of Sunken Past, Yudi Gossamer Jade, Whisper Wind Compass, Face Stone of Bounce, the Foster Mechanic, and some cards with the Upkeep label keyword. As you can see, this templating is frequently used for cards that trigger at certain parts of the turn. To reiterate, triggers with templating using this intervening if clause will not trigger at all if that additional condition is not met when it tries to trigger, and will not resolve if that condition is not met upon resolution. Our last pattern is pattern number 4, which uses the bolded key phrase on enter. This one will be quick because this templating actually works exactly the same as pattern 2. That is, it has no extra conditions when it triggers, and checks the extra condition when it resolves. These triggers will pretty much always provide opportunity to both players before it resolves and checks the additional condition. If you're wondering where all the card examples for pattern 2 went, that's because they're mostly using this templating instead. Examples of cards with this templating are Tristan Hired Blade, Diana Ether Dilettante, Sylvie with the Pack, Charged Hunter, Sirocco Operative, Ardent Cloud Striker, Conduit of Seasons, the on-attack trigger, Razor Broadhead, Dynasty Chancellor, Rococo Explosive Maven, Lily Marine Castellan, as well as cards like Zhang Jiao, Way of Peace, and Rouge Ace of Hearts. In summary, if a triggered ability has an additional condition, the way that condition is checked differs depending on the templating of the ability. If the additional condition is part of the trigger condition, it will check only upon triggering and will not go onto the stack if that condition is not met. It will not check the condition upon resolution. If the additional condition is part of the resolution, or if it uses a bolded key phrase, the ability will trigger and go onto the stack by default, and only check that condition when the trigger resolves. If the additional trigger condition is within an intervening if clause, that condition must be met both when the ability attempts to trigger and when it attempts to resolve. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching.